One thing that I do want to do is make sure that this is an extremely interactive discussion associated with, the concept of innovation and supply chain. And, one of the things that, I actually want to explore is what is IT's role, or what is a CIO's role in that relationship, between, let's say, the market or the environment, much like Nick talked about, and then internal within an organization, and then what are the drivers for that? And I think what you'll find is, many different places that some companies, are driven by CEOs, some companies are driven by CFOs. In my career, I've been a CIO at multiple companies. I've never once reported into a CEO, only CFOs. And I think, that when I look at those underlying pins, there's always a driver towards that in terms of how, and what the directions are, and then really the interaction. And then that gets back into the innovation question. Are we really challenged as an IT organization to innovate? And then if so, what does that really mean? Or are we there to really implement what others innovate? Throughout today, that talked about, the improvements. I call them soft versus hard benefits. If you can improve a process, there's no financial result associated with that. In other words, it doesn't have a bottom line to a line item in a budget. If somebody's not committing to increasing revenue, which is only the sales guy, or decreasing costs, which could end up being anybody within the organization, who holds a line item budget, all of those things are really the interpretation of whatever that culture is of that company that you work for. So I'd like you to consider these type of things, throughout the process. And then just consider, being inside of an organization responsible for that type of activity and how you manifest that to the actions and to the execution, which I do believe all of us heard today. At the end of the day, execution is where the real money is being made. And from an IT executive, are you executing something new or executing something that already exists? So with ideas, and we know, what they are. And I think we miss opportunities when we don't make that a yes. It doesn't mean that everything has to be a cost saving. For example, you're never going to prove a return on an ERP solution. I don't think you could ever do that. They cost too much, even if you went to a cloud, service provider. By the time you do the replacement cost, there's not that much value in there. There just isn't there. Now, it is, on the other hand, a requirement for companies to do business. I call it the light switch. At the end of the day, nobody expects you to do anything except when they walk in the morning, they want to plug in, they want to see email, which means they want the network to work, they want Exchange to come up, or whatever cloud solution you have, and then they want to be able to go over there and press a button and get a report and so forth. But they have that as an expectation. So that to me is always this baseline, and that's something.
Rob, just one thing at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about working with the scientists and the chemical engineers, and something I can empathize with, working with our bioscience division, and definitely understand, them talking a different language. They might as well speak in a foreign language in a lot of the terms that they're talking about. But I was wondering, how would it be received? You might not understand a lot of the technical terms from a scientific perspective, but as they're going through those test processes, as they're testing out new drugs or samples, there's a lot you could bring to the table from a technology perspective. You're talking about machine learning or predictive analysis on how you can reduce that cycle time, how you can reduce that test case. I'm actually working with Saroj on something very similar at SRI. But I was wondering, how would that be received by your divisions by doing that and taking that technology to them?
I think it depends on who you would talk to. So in that particular example, I'll go back to the interview. I interviewed with the CEO. His comment was, look, you're now in the Silicon Valley, we want you, to have a greater role within the company, right? So he would say, absolutely. I think if you go to the CFO, he would say, I don't really give a shit what you do as long as you stay within, your 35 million.
Right.
He wouldn't care, right? I think if I then go and talk to Mike, who I happen to know from a previous life, that's exactly what we talked about, is the learning from data, right? So we don't have drugs, that prevent, illnesses or diseases or viruses, right? It's actually a molecular process that figures out whether you have something. So if you think of the H, type viruses, HIV and so forth, they used to take 4 days to get a, because you'd have to put a culture in and it would have to sit for whatever, 3 days or 4 days. So by the time the person figured out whether they had it, time had went by, right? Somebody was mentioning Bill Gates, earlier, well, that's the World Health Organization. So when there was that Ebola breakout, a couple of years back, we actually flew our machines down there. You can now have a potential to get it done in 90 days. That, as most of them would. But again, you have to make that argument. Those arguments are not easy. They're tough to go do, but it does work. So I guess the bottom tagline is really where I kind of wanted to end on this slide, which is the impacts. Are you really improving stuff? Or are you innovating? And if you're generating revenue, or you're controlling costs. But if you're just controlling costs and you're a cost center, if you're generating revenue or increasing margins, then you're a profit center. I'm sure all of you know what that is and what that means, right? But there's a big difference between the perception of that, versus, let's say, of a profit center IT organization versus a cost center type IT organization. And one sort of sits at the table, and one sort of gets invited from the next door or the next room. So I think that in the end, the IT organization and the CIO role specifically, need to take new technology, and it's really got to solve a problem. You don't always have to implement technology, or let's say you don't have to go look at technology and then find a problem to solve it. So it's somewhat of the opposite. Another little quick story. I had a vendor come in the other day and started telling me about in-memory computing and how fast it was and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, I got it. And then he whipped out, a Fitbit. And I said, oh, yeah, I got one of those too, I check it out. So he put it on his shoe, and he started flipping his leg up and down. And he said, see how cool that is? I can tell you right now how many steps I got. And I looked at him and I said, hey, that's great, but so what do you do with that? And I think he had some cool technology. It was fast and it was processing, but frankly, there's a bunch of them out there. And I don't know what he differentiated from, let's say one technology to the other than the fact that it gets demonstrated on his foot with a Fitbit, in 2 seconds. I don't know how you turn that into revenue. And then at the end of the meeting, I asked him, what are you asking me to do? Tell you that it's cool? Or invest, $100,000 or $1 million in this server? Of course, he didn't ask for money, but ultimately he will someday. Proving some of those things, and I think you're going to be in trouble. On the other side, you do have a responsibility from a publicly traded company that you really have to go look at some of those savings and really look at, where the savings have come from. So Cool actually gave me this next line. He said that CFOs won't believe any savings unless it has a line item budget in the plan. So, if you can't get the sales guy to increase revenue, then all these projections don't matter. How many times have you sat in a room and they said, look, we're going to offer a better reporting solution and it's going to free 40% of your time. And I said, what do you do with that? Can I cut 40% of the staff? Well, no. But they can free it up to do something different. Well, I'm not, that to me is not a return on investment. That's like an investment on an investment, which is two totally different things. But you still have to market. Those are problems that every company has and has to deal with. And then, of course, I mentioned the ERP, but the more expensive, your implementations, you really need to make sure you consider what those added values are. Is it really worth it? I mean, I see a lot of my peers, they spend a lot of money. Adir, I think you said your son, was at Cisco. I went to the CIO's, he had a summit one day, and I went up there, and his PC budget was greater than my total budget. Just to put it in perspective, right? And I thought, well, no wonder you can do all these cool things, right? Now I get that, companies like that, including Microsoft, they all eat their own dog food, and they expect the CIOs to actually generate inside of that world, right? So they're doing exactly what I think I'm challenging you and even myself to go do. I work in a biotech company, so it's far more difficult, and I don't use any of our products, whereas the Cisco guy uses all his products. So, by the way, he can probably go downstairs and just get a PC or get a switch or whatever he needs to do to improve those things. It's a very different, set of activity, but those are all challenges that we deal with every day, right? And in the past 20 years, have we really seen innovation in supply chain, in order to cash, in operations, in finance, in accounting? I would argue, yeah, from a technology point of view, but the reality is they're kind of doing the same thing. They're really not, changing anything dramatically. We're better at them. We're making great improvements in them. But if you think about finance, it's generated or ruled by GAAP. So how far and how much can you innovate around that place? Even the supply chain. We can do, better distribution, faster distribution, and so forth. But the concept of the supply chain really hasn't changed in 20 years, or at least 30 years, or at least in my lifetime, or my working time, right? And probably, I think Nick had the thing up there with a horse and carriage and a train and so forth and so on, but it's the same thing. They delivered it differently, and it took longer as opposed to delivering it faster and took shorter, but you know what? They do the same thing. Get technology as a group to solve business problems. New technology is cool, it's fun, it's exciting, and all that good stuff, but is SAP still here? Okay, good. So, no. Look, I'm a big SAP fan. I've been doing SAP since, the 1.2 release, back in the early 90s. But I'll tell you, HANA's a wonderful thing. Oh, you're SAP? Okay. Well, there you go. So, it is a wonderful thing. But that doesn't mean that every company would invest $500,000 to $1 million in a HANA platform, right? And I'll give you a prime example. A couple of the SAP guys came in last week and they're like, hey, how come you're not doing HANA? And I'm like, look, we're a one-trick pony. We have 23 tests approved by the FDA. We have one cartridge, and the magic sauce is inside that cartridge. And that's where all the chemical and the biological and all the molecular design is. And trust me, that is extremely complex. But at the end of the day, we have one cartridge, you put a sample in it, you shove it in a machine, it takes about 2 minutes, it spits out the result on the back end. And so the point being is, we don't have the volume nor the requirement to really use HANA today, right? And so I'm not going to buy HANA until we get to the point where maybe we have 150 or some larger volume of content or data associated with that, right? So I think HANA is all good things, but I think you need to have a business problem that it's solving. You don't want to do HANA just because it's cool and it's faster, And on the ERP side, even at IR, same thing. A couple of years ago, they came out, they want to talk about HANA and this and that. I'm like, so what are you going to do for me? It takes about 1 second to create a sales order. So you want me to have it go to 2 nanoseconds? Do you think the business is going to invest in going from really fast to super really fast? I don't think so, Now, if you use it for the application that they're talking about, it's fantastic. If you can get a report down from 20 minutes or 4 days to 7 seconds, now we're talking in terms of, investment. So those are the things where I think you really have to take a look at it. It's cool, it's exciting, it's fun, it's new, and we're all technology guys, so we all want the new stuff. But if it doesn't have business value, what are you doing it for? So you have to really look at that. Maybe you got all this new cool technology, but it really didn't help, the enterprise. Remember who's funding, right? Who signs the check? Who's the guy that's doing the investment? I'll go back to the example with Mike, at Cepheid. He's the one that had the money. He's the one that had the check, not even the CFO. R&D budgets are sort of distant, from CFOs anyways. They get a big bucket and then they can kind of do whatever they want with it. So, if you're going to target that, make sure you understand, where the funding is going to come from, because none of this stuff is free. And then look at the culture and the organizational objectives that you have. I referenced, the CEO when I had the interview. He's a wonderful man, and over the, 9 or 10 months that I've been there, he really cares about changing people's lives. He's 74 years old. That's why he's still working. He's probably worth multiple millions of dollars, but he doesn't really care. He just wants to go save lives, and that's all he ever talks about. You know, so if you can go in and tap on that, then you can get engaged in some other activities, right? If you can't relate to that, then you'll probably never have a follow-on conversation with him, in my example.